Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of this show. And if you're new to the program, go check out our archives because we've got some great interviews with smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs of companies and organizations ranging from Netflix to Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, Lending Tree, Quicken, Redfin. We had Grubhub the other week. I'm also the co-founder of Rise25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And my guest here today, first, before I get to him, I want to give a shout out to David C. Baker, who is his co-host for one of the podcasts that he does. It was a past guest on my podcast. If you haven't heard that episode, you might want to check out that one as well, because they talk about a lot of similar principles. But my guest here today is Blair Enns. He's the founder of Win Without Pitching. It's a sales training organization for creative professionals. It's author of the Win Without Pitching Manifesto and Pricing Creativity, a guide to profit beyond the billable hour. He's also co-host of the Two Bobs podcast, and he's got another newer podcast called 20%, which you have to go check out as well. And of course, this episode brought to you by Rise25, where we help B2B businesses get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And if you're listening to this and thinking about starting a podcast like Blair and I both have, go check out our website because there's lots of resources there for how you can do it. Rise25.com is the website, or you can email us at support@rise25.com. All right, Blair, pleasure to have you here. I've known of your work for a long time. I'm also active in the Bureau of Digital, where there's lots of agency owners, and it feels like every week someone is citing you and saying, check out Blair Enns, check out Blair Enns. But I want to start at the beginning of your journey, because you've got this great story about you weren't too crazy about college. You were trying to figure out whether you wanted to continue. I think that's a nice way of putting it. And you have this story that I heard. You're sitting in the dean's office waiting to go in, and you look across the street and there's a travel agency, and this looks like a picture out of a movie. This is like a scene out of a movie where you're like, do I go this way to the dean's office, continue with college, or do I go and travel? And you decided to pick travel, which I love. So tell us that story, how that unfolded.
Yeah, it was the last day where I could get written permission from the dean to be allowed back in to attend the second year of a liberal arts university in the small Canadian city where I grew up. And I had this money in my pocket, and I was not a very good student. I was a great student until the end of third grade, and then something changed, and I don't know what changed. After that, I was never a very good student, which is funny because I really consider myself a lifelong learner. But in that moment, I was sitting in the outer office of the dean's office, and I needed her written permission to attend the second year. It was a formality. I had to go in and say, yeah, I'm going to be a good student. And a friend of mine was in a similar situation. So we're both waiting in the outer office. And we look across the street, and there's a travel agency, and they had these flight passes for a now defunct Canadian airline. And then Bruce Springsteen concert tickets. So this was 1984 or 85, I guess. In Toronto. So we thought, screw this. We went across the street, bought the flight passes, the concert tickets, and then traveled for the rest of the summer. And no regrets. I probably shouldn't have done the first year of university. I wasn't ready at the time. I did go back. I went back to community college. I did a 2-year business administration diploma that I crammed into 3 years. So it was barely. I don't know if you heard this part of the story, John. So I go back and do this. I was such a lazy young man. And I do this program, and I don't do it in the 2 years, and it's a really easy program. But I really enjoyed the social aspect of going to school. I took a third year to finish, and then I was a credit short. I did the math wrong. After an easy 2-year program, in the 3 years, I was still a credit short. And I thought, I'm like, nah, I got to get on with my life here. So I had a meeting with that dean and I convinced him to give me a credit to get rid of me because I was already a pain in his ass too. So yeah, that's my stellar academic
Threw you
career.
a credit. Threw you one more credit. That's great. Do you remember?
He threw me a credit because like
what for? Do you remember? Was there one thing you pointed to and you're like, but I did this thing?
Yeah. So there was I could have done a physical education, like I could have had a credit for going to like a volleyball class or something. And I didn't, but I worked out every day. And there was a young man about my age who had cerebral palsy, he was in great shape. He had a problem with his legs and other health issues, but he wanted to work out and he needed somebody to work out with him. So for a couple of semesters, I just weight trained with this guy just because a friend of mine was doing it previously and he left so I took it over and I just said, hey, like I did this for 2 semesters. Can't you just give me that credit for that effort and you will never see me again? He said, deal.
It's funny. We have these pivotal moments in our life that we can look back to and kind of say, that kind of makes sense in what I do now. I had a similar experience in high school where I convinced a teacher the day after the last day of the semester to change my grade. And I did it based on like finding one problem that I got wrong in a math test and letting me redo it. And I said, if I get this right, you got to change my grade. And she did. Wow. For you, with that story that you just told, does it make sense now what you do, that you are helping others to sell and to be persuasive?
Yeah, I don't know, because, this idea that selling is persuasion, I actually don't subscribe to that theory. I think selling, when it comes to professional services, when it's done properly, is not about talking people into things. I actually think it's a different social dynamic altogether. I think it begins with crafting a meaningfully different value proposition and then going in search of those who you can help, and just being really discerning about who you want to do business with. And that discernment needs to come through in the first conversation. So I actually don't see the correlation there. I think it's just a fun story. There probably is one, but it's not something that is immediately obvious to me.
Yeah. You have an interesting trajectory because you were interested in writing, creativity. You're really inspired by, I believe it was the book, All the President's Men, interested in journalism, but you also had kind of the business side to you as well, which is compelling to me, because I've always felt like I've been similar in the sense that there's kind of a creative side to me and a business side to me. So talk a little bit about how you kind of found your way as you got into the creative services and you were attracted to the creative side and you ultimately kind of, went into business development as well.
Yeah. So when I did end up going to this community college, I had to decide, did I want to take business administration? I always had aspirations of being an entrepreneur. Or did I want to take, I forget what it's called, creative communications, I think, basically writing as a career. And so I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but deep in my heart, I really, that question, what's the one thing, if you knew you wouldn't fail, what's the one thing you would do? To me, the answer has always been, I would be a writer. And I had to make a decision between the two. I chose business because I didn't think journalism at the time, which I saw as one of the most noble professions on the planet, I didn't think it would pay well. I wanted a nicer standard of living. And then when I did become an entrepreneur, even before I became an entrepreneur, it's almost ironic that I found that most of what I was doing was writing, and then building my business, Win Without Pitching, which is a training company today, but it began as a solo consulting practice. I built that business through writing. And when I did business development for ad agencies and design firms previously, I did most of my lead generation work through writing, through content marketing, before it was even called content marketing. I think we called it education-based marketing. I was writing blog posts and sending them via fax because there was no email and there were no websites to post them to. So I would write these articles and I would fax them to my prospective clients.
Interesting. And I'm curious, did you get pushback back then when you were doing business development? You know, did you ever have supervisors who are saying, you know, why are you doing that when you should be just knocking on doors, or you should be going to visit another prospect? Why are you working on writing these blog posts and faxing them out to people? Or did you work for, you know, did you have people above you who kind of saw its potential?
No, I worked for a great guy who was very understanding. So I'm a Canadian. I live in Canada. I've always been based in Canada. Our company today is global, like a lot of companies are. But at the time, I was in Calgary running a field office for a Vancouver-based agency. And the previous manager of that office had, I forget what our titles were, but the previous guy, the guy I replaced, all the clients were friends of his. So when he left, all the clients left, and I showed up to basically an empty client roster and only one other employee in addition to myself. And I said to the owner, I'm going to take my time to do this and do it right. And he said, yeah, however you want, we trust you. So I had his and his wife's, who was his business partner, I had their full support to do it this way. And it didn't take long for it to bear fruit.
Do you think you were helped by the fact that back then there wasn't as much content marketing? And So someone taking that approach, that education-based approach, had kind of an advantage?
Well, first I wrote a few posts, started sending them. And then at some point, email became a thing, like early on in this tenure. And I started, so I would follow up. First I was sending by fax, and then I would, after they'd received a couple, I would start just calling everybody on my list. And then at some point, so this is probably around 1999, maybe 2000, email is a thing, and people in small numbers are starting to use it for, maybe it's 2000. Yeah, somewhere around 2000. People are starting to use it for business. So it was back in those days, it was really easy to guess what somebody's email address might be. If they had a website, they had a domain. And when I was selling to more tech savvy companies, more technology based businesses, it was more likely that they were going to have an email address. So when I started reaching out via email, my response rate was 70%. My response rate was 70%. So just think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's phenomenal.
7% is something else. Like,
yeah.
Well, an open rate of 7% isn't very good, but that, like, it was just a crazy time where there's this new medium, and I was on it early. And at the time, when you got an email from somebody outside of your organization, it was an event. It was exciting. So most of my emails got responses, and I found myself in conversations pretty quickly.
Yeah. Which, of course, conversations is one of the things that you're a big fan of. One of your principles in your book, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, is that we should do conversations instead of presentations. But before that, the first one that you list, you're a big advocate of specialization. You, at this time that you were talking about in your career, you were working for larger companies, McCann Erickson, Young & Rubicam. These are large companies that have a variety of different services. Talk to me a little bit about how you kind of develop that idea of specialization, especially in the backdrop of working for a much larger organization, where I would think it would be hard for you to say, hey, we're going to specialize, because it's a large organization. They want to provide a variety of different services.
Yeah. When I was working for Y&R and McCann Erickson, I was working in account management and not in new business on those accounts. And it wasn't until I moved on to a smaller firm it was an interesting firm. They were trying to pull off an interesting positioning in that they had different divisions. So they had these different practice areas, and that rolled up to just kind of a bit of a mess. So there was no other than, you could say, integrated marketing communications, but even that wasn't real. Like there was an advertising division, there was a design division, there was a real estate marketing division, there was an Asian language marketing division. So it was just like they didn't really fit together nicely. But if you're pursuing a prospect, the prospect would cleanly typically fall into one of those four categories, and the advertising and design would blend together. But I stayed away from real estate marketing that was highly specialized. I didn't know anything about Asian language, so it was advertising and design that was still fairly broad. And I found myself in situations where it's like, my initial outreach was, as it was in an earlier job where I worked for a small full service marketing communication agency, the outreach is, here's a list of things that we could do for you. Do you have any need in any of these areas? Actually, the approach was, hey, can I just come in and have a meeting with you so I can talk you into hiring us for one of these many different things that we might do for you?
Yeah.
And I'm not, there's a profile of salespeople, and by that I mean people who do outbound lead generation who are very successful. That is like smile and dial, rejection proof, relentless. I am not that person. I think my motto is, there's a better way to do this, and I will find it, even if it takes me 4 times longer. So yeah. I initially thought, well, this is too hard. So when I started to lead with very specific value propositions, I started to get traction. So even though the firm wasn't really all that well specialized, I would do outreach and I would say, hey, I'd start to use this approach. I'd say, hey, I know you work with other agencies, and I'm sure they're very good at what they do. But the reason I'm calling you is we have this one thing that we do better than pretty much anybody else. Maybe you have a need for it, maybe you don't. And I would lead with that thing, and that thing would always be different, because the truth was we were generalists for the most part. So I would pick a specialism that I thought might be relevant to that person in that moment. And my introduction would basically be me saying we were specialists in this area. And what I found was it's like you're trying, I don't know what the metaphor is, trying to find a needle in a haystack or something, or you're aiming for the target, but I would miss. But some people would say, no, we don't have any need in that area. We're covered. But do you also do X? Mm. And that, by leading with a narrow value proposition, gave me credibility, because the other conversations that these people were having with other firms like mine was the old approach of, hey, I've got all these different things I could do for you. Can you invite me into your office so I can talk you into hiring me? Right. So in that approach, the client is back on their heels. And with my more targeted approach, even when I missed with the targeting, it gave me credibility. It felt like, well, if there isn't a fit here from my point of view, I think to the client, it felt like I was discerning and I was looking to help with a very small set of specific problems. And if they didn't have a need there, but they had a need in a related area, discipline, or market, they might bring that up. And that was a more powerful approach for me.
It's amazing, this principle of specialization, how it seems like it's a never ending problem. In so many different industries. I'm a recovering lawyer now. When I was practicing law, lawyers had this problem. They'd try and take anything that came in the door. They didn't specialize. I found my practice there. Once I specialized, things really kind of took off at that point. Same thing with the work that we do now. It's highly specialized, but it's such a challenge. Like, do you think that this is a challenge that will ever go away? Or how do you even approach it with people these days, with companies that that raise the same objections over and over again that you've been hearing for years and years?
Objections around specializing?
Yeah.
I don't hear them anymore. And it might be a selection bias, but the market has absolutely changed. So if you think of the world that I serve, which is the world of creative agencies, when I launched Win Without Pitching 20 years ago, there were basically ad agencies and design firms. And there were large ad agencies and design firms and small ad agencies and design firms. And the large agencies had a way of doing things. And when it comes to sales, that meant pitching the ideas for free, hoping to win the account, and then make it up earn the money on the media placement or other follow-on services. And the small agencies took all of their cues from the large agencies. They were the model for how to behave. So everybody behaved the same way. And I come along, and David Baker comes along, and Tim Williams comes along, and other people, and we come along, and we state the obvious that no, if you want a sales advantage, if you want to get better at selling what you do, you really need to specialize, concentrate on solving a smaller number of problems for or a smaller number of people, build a depth of expertise by going narrower, and then you can set yourself apart in a meaningfully differentiated way. So we were preaching the message of specialization 20 years ago, and David Baker, I think it's 28 years ago, and I forget how long Tim Williams has been doing this, and it's not just the three of us, but I remember the three of us being out there early, and there was a lot of pushback at the time. I haven't had pushback on it in a while, and now today you have in the creative services firms market, you have a fully bifurcated market where on one side you have the large ad agencies, and nothing has really changed for them. But most of the market is now small. The smaller firms are not small generalist ad agencies trying to look big. They're actually specialist marketing or communication or product development firms. That market is fragmented so much. So you have so much specialism in that space. The idea that you wouldn't specialize in that market, it's just a conversation that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, it happens, but it's pretty rare. That message has largely been received, and the principles have been applied. So, and again, it could be a selection bias because the people who come to us for training are probably
bought in already, right?
They probably, they read the first proclamation of the Win Without Pitching 10 years ago. They've specialized, but it's not. I'm not claiming credit for it. I'm just saying it was obvious this was the way the market is going. Yeah. And it's clearly gone that way.
What about one of your other principles is to be selective. A lot of times people are, a lot of companies right now at this moment in time, we're recording this in November 1st of 2022. There's questions about the economy, business maybe is slowing down. I don't know if that's true or not. What do you say to clients that say to you, we can't be selective now, the economy, XYZ, blame whatever reason. What do you say to that?
There are always people who point to external reasons, external conditions for reasons why they can't do what they should do, like logical business practices. And it's never the external condition. It's either you have this within you to make the difficult business decision of specializing, or to show up and be professional and selective, or you don't have it within you. And if you don't have it within you, it's a skill that you want to develop. And it's such a cop out to look at the market and say, oh, this has changed, or this opportunity is big, so therefore it's permission to behave differently, et cetera. And I sometimes feel like I'm not the cop here. Like it's your business. Dear listener, you're free to do with it whatever you want. But in my role as an advisor to agencies, I sometimes hear the excuse of, well, it's almost never the economy. Like, I'm not saying the economy does not put pressure on the fundamentals of the business. It's just not a reason to behave differently. So because the economy is difficult, instead of showing up like a selective, discerning expert, you're going to show up like a needy vendor. That doesn't make sense. There's no rational basis for that. What it is, it's basically defaulting to a more kind of primary, primitive amygdala-driven response, fight or flight-driven response. That's what it is. There's no logical basis for it.
Yeah. We were talking earlier about when you were doing content marketing via fax, there wasn't a lot of competition. So a lot of people weren't, it's kind of a different ballgame. Now, of course, I think people understand you need to create content. And one of your principles is we will build expertise rapidly. And I imagine a piece of that is also communicating it through blog posts, podcasts, things like that. What are some of the ways in which you see really savvy firms building their expertise quickly today?
First of all, that principle or proclamation in the book is really a derivative of narrowing your focus and specializing, the first proclamation, where it's because when you narrow your focus, you deepen the set of problems. So a great metaphor for this is you imagine the sum capabilities of your firm as contained in a bottle of beer. So you take a bottle of beer and the contents represent your sum capabilities, all your expertise, et cetera. And your positioning, or what we call in broader business, like your fundamental business strategy, is the vessel into which you choose to pour the contents of that bottle. So you could choose to pour it into the contents into a casserole dish, and then you look at the physical representation of your expertise. It is broad and shallow. Or you could pour it into a Pilsner glass, and you look at the shape that you get there. It's narrow and deep. And you look at the difference in depth between one firm and another that is delineated by the shape of the container. And that Pilsner glass, you look at that firm, the depth of expertise that firm has is it's multiples of the more generalist firm, but the area to which it's relevant is not as broadly relevant, right? So that's what we're trying to do. And that call to people to try to build expertise rapidly. A lot of generalist firms, especially in the marketing communication space field, they don't even know what expertise is. And again, this isn't a real, it's not a very common condition these days where you get these generalists, but back in my day, you get this generalist ad agency. People in advertising are very creative and have a lot of confidence, and they tend to not know how much they don't know. And they're really good at bluffing their way, commanding a room and bluffing their way through scenarios. And early in my career, when I would convince some of these owners of specialist firms or of generalist firms to specialize, the transformation in their own sense of their expertise and the depth of their expertise was profound. So you don't, like, narrowing your focus isn't enough, right? Narrowing your focus causes you to quit looking all over the place, focus on a specific set of problems, and then that allows you to go deep. And so that, like, calling to people to build expertise rapidly, when you're a generalist, you don't even know what that means. You don't even appreciate the depth of expertise that is possible when you narrow the set of problems that you solve and or the types of organizations or individuals for whom you help solve.
Yeah.
So
that's this reminds me again of when I was practicing law and I worked for firms that did divorces and they did litigation and non-litigation and they did bankruptcies. And there was no way you can have any kind of expertise when you have to have knowledge in all these different areas. It was just absolutely impossible.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, in a large firm, you can pull that off by having dedicated practice areas, right? So
more heads, more bodies. Yeah.
Yeah,
more people,
that's possible.
too.
But when you're starting out, the woman who cuts my hair across the street from my office here, years ago when I met her and I told her about my business, we started talking about specialization. She said, when I launched my haircutting practice, she has very curly hair. My wife has very curly hair, or my wife has curly hair. And she said, I ran an ad that said specializing in curly hair. And she said, I was sold out almost immediately. I was inundated because in that field, nobody ever thought it made sense to specialize. Mm-hmm. I cut hair. You have hair, I cut it.
Yeah.
And that's in that agency world, we do ads. You need ads, we've got ads.
Yeah. Right. Right. A bunch of the principles in your book relate to getting paid. So we will not solve problems before we are paid. That's a big one because people can get drawn into that trap of going.
Did you work in private practice as a lawyer?
I did. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you? But so, I mean, lawyers are good at some aspects of selling and poor at other aspects of them.
For sure. Yeah.
It's probably not very often that you started working on an engagement before you received at least a deposit. Is that correct?
Well, that's what's funny about it is because it's very easy to get into problem solving. I remember specifically a firm I worked for where we ended up meeting with a potential client for like an hour and a half. And it was clear like 20 minutes into this that this person was just fishing for advice and trying to get answers. And then they were going to go around and shop around and stuff like that. And, eventually I figured out that you got to cut these things off. You got to tell them like, I'd love to help you with this. This is, I can help solve your problem, but you can't just go and just sit there and be a fountain of knowledge and let them pick and choose and then go off on their own.
That's one of the challenges with selling expertise, like a professional service, like legal is you're a lawyer, you're trained in lawyering, you're trained to solve the client's problem. So and this happens in the agency world too. So in a sale, you put subject matter experts in front of a client. What do? They start solving their problem. So we need to actually withhold in the sale our expertise, and we need to have frameworks that help us navigate the sale. And I think there's something about the word sales, selling, that most of us as professionals, we look down our nose at. And so we don't think we need sales training. Even in the agency world that I serve, we don't call it sales. We call it new business development, because S is a dirty word. If I send an email to my list of 30,000 people that has the S word in the subject line, the open rate plummets. So we use the S word, sales word, all the time, but I don't use it in the subject line of an email.
Right. Because people know they need it, but they don't. They also have this kind of like, distaste towards that idea. Yeah,
and if you're a professional, there is some obligation for you to sell what it is that you do. You need a framework for being able to do that. And if you don't have a framework, and if you haven't had, if you don't have a framework or know how to use it, what are you going to do in a sale? You're going to start solving the problem as proof of your ability to solve the problem. And in the creative world, that is a really big, expensive problem. It's called free pitching. And that's why my business is called Win Without Pitching. We deprogram creative firms of this need to give their thinking away for free, to begin to solve the problem as proof of their ability to solve the problem.
Yeah. Is a lot of that founded in a base kind of insecurity that the prospect may judge them to be not up to the task, or don't trust that they're able to do it?
There's a few things. So on the selling side, on the agency side, creativity is the ability to see. It's not the ability to write or draw. It's the ability to bring a novel perspective to a problem. So if you are a creative person, you are fascinated by the problem that you have not previously solved. So every new opportunity that comes to you is like fascinating. So you kind of lose your shit and start behaving like a child a little bit. And you're so emotionally overinvested. So there's that. But on the buying side, the client side, buying creativity is a little bit like a drug deal, where the value proposition of a generalist creative firm is, I'm going to sell you some crazy shit. It's going to be crazy. You're not going to believe how crazy this is. And the client responds with, oh, okay, well, I'm looking for some crazy stuff, but like not too crazy. So you're kind of scaring me a little bit. And I don't like, what does crazy mean? So can I try some of this stuff before I buy it? So it's there's this fear and uncertainty there that's tied to this, a too basic value proposition of just, we're creative. What we're going to sell you is going to be really different and zany, et cetera. So, and there are other issues too, but so on the buying side, they're just looking for some certainty. They're looking for some sort of assurance that everything's going to be okay. And on the selling side, A, it's highly ingrained, but B, there's something in the nature of what it means to be creative that makes this professional selling, where you're discerning, a little bit difficult because you're so emotionally invested in solving the problem. You get creative people just to get really excited. And I don't, when I say creative people, there are lots of creative people out there. There are creative lawyers there. If you're an entrepreneur, you're probably a creative person to some extent. So you get excited about the possibility. And if you want to get better at selling, 3 words: no sunk costs. Do not overinvest in the sale. And that starts with emotions. Don't get super excited or attached to anything early in the sale.
Yeah. One of the other principles that I love is we will address issues of money early. And, getting back again to when I was practicing law, it was a challenge that I had to work on as I went to work for myself, was being willing to say to the client, stop everything. We need to have a conversation about money. And I imagine that is a challenge with many of the clients that you work with, is stopping and saying, we need to talk about money.
Yeah. The win without pitching rule of money, I talk about it in the book, the Manifesto, is this: those who don't talk about it don't make it. So I just have to say that a couple of times to people and they realize, okay, yeah, this is hard. Money conversations are stressful because stress is caused by the things you don't do, the things that you are ignoring, putting off. So if you want to learn to get comfortable with money conversations, teach yourself just early on. It's not particularly easy, but it gets easier quickly. Just go to the money issue quickly. Don't wait to the end. And as soon as there's a red flag that, the client might not be able to afford you, just say, hey, before we get too far, I'm getting a sense that affordability might be an issue here. We typically work with larger organizations. I don't know how else to say this, but I'm getting the sense that you seem to be a bit price sensitive. Then stop and say nothing. You'll get all kinds of valuable information in the silence.
That's a great statement to say it that way. Let them let the silence just kind of overrun a little bit. Well, I want to ask you. We're running a little bit short on time here, but I want to first ask about your podcast because I'm a longtime podcaster, 12 years now. Big fan of it. You have an unusual format with your podcast that you've done for a number of years with David C. Baker, and that it's the two of you chatting. Which to be honest, I don't see many podcasts that go for a long period of time where it's two people talking. So what do you think is the secret behind that? Why do you think you've been able to sustain it, especially where you have two people that are not in business together?
Yeah. So we run different businesses that serve the same markets. We've been friends for over 15 years. And we started this podcast as a way to just stay in touch more regularly. So what's the secret? I think really the secret, we've been doing this over 6, maybe 7 years now. And we do an episode every 2 weeks. I think the secret is that we would have run out of things to talk about a long time ago had we both not been avid content creators. David publishes every week, and I publish. My goal right now is every 2 weeks. And because we do a podcast every 2 weeks, we basically alternate. David will write, and he and I both have hundreds of things that we've written over the years. So if I don't have anything fresh, I'll just go back and find an article I wrote years ago, and I'll send it to Dave, and I'll say, okay, this week it's my turn to be kind of the interviewee. I'd like you to interview me on this blog post. But we're both creating content at a fast enough pace that it basically goes like this. And David follows roughly the same pattern, but some of the details are slightly different. I create a blog post. It goes to my team. It gets sent as an email. It's posted on the website. It's sent as an email. I write a different version of that, post it to LinkedIn. I write a different version of that. I turn it into a Twitter thread. I post it on Twitter. I shoot a 60-second video. It gets posted to different platforms. And 1 in 2 of those posts I will nominate to David and say, hey, why don't you interview me on this post? So every second post on average, it gets turned into a podcast where it's just a deeper conversation on that subject. So David will read the article and then we just have a conversation about it. And sometimes the podcast episode is the impetus for the blog post and everything else, where there's nothing in the canon of work that I've done that we haven't talked about already that I want to talk about. So, if you create a lot, you always have a million unfinished ideas in your head or noted. David writes all his down. He's got hundreds of them. I tend to carry most of them in my head and maybe about a dozen in Evernote. So I'll pick a topic and I'll quickly send him an outline. I'll say, here's what I want to talk about. And I'll do the outline. And when I'm done the outline, later that day, or maybe immediately after or the next day, I will turn it into a blog post. So it's a way of taking a singular piece of content and going in multiple different directions. So both David and I see ourselves as writers first. And the podcast is a logical extension of the writing that we do. And had we not written so much, each of us over the last 20 years, it would be really hard to pull this podcast off because it would just be two idiots having a conversation.
Right. Which there's plenty of those types of podcasts out there, but fortunately you're not another one of them. And then you started another one. So 20%, the Marketing Procurement Podcast. Talk about the impetus behind that one.
Yeah, this is such a niche podcast. It's almost like a hobby of mine. There's a problem in the world that I serve. I call it the marketing procurement problem. The problem is that the professional buyers in my clients' businesses, the big companies in the world who buy marketing services and creativity in particular, I'll just make a general overstatement, be a little hard on them. They don't know what they're doing. The truth is, when it comes to buying marketing services, they're very good at it and they're very good at finding efficiencies and doing their job. But when it comes to buying creativity, you can't force efficiencies into the procurement of creativity or innovation without diminishing that which you are buying. And this is a poorly understood principle. I recently wrote a 3,300 word blog post on it called the inefficiency problem. I've invented a word. Inefficiency is a combination.
Sounds like a word.
Innovation and efficiency. So inefficiency. And the idea that innovation and efficiency are mutually opposable objectives, you cannot increase one without decreasing the other. So that's a fundamental problem in business that very few people understand. And where it's made manifest most clearly to me is in the procurement of marketing services, where these people are trying to more efficiently procure creativity and innovation. So they're driving the costs down. They're beating up the agency, and they don't understand that when you drive efficiencies into something like that, you kill the ability to innovate, to iterate, etc. It's a whole rabbit hole I don't want to go down, but 20%, the Marketing Procurement Podcast, is a podcast I'm doing with somebody else, Leah Power. We're trying to solve this marketing procurement problem. We're trying to get the people who procure marketing services to appreciate that, man, if you squeeze all of the waste out of your agency, you're also squeezing the creativity out of them.
That's great. Well, we'll certainly tell everyone to check that out. We'll put a link in the blog post.
You say it's great, but it's like, I saw your eyes glazing over. It's an eyes glaze over topic. Procuring creativity. So the total addressable market for this podcast is really small,
but super specialized, right?
Yeah.
Blair, this has been great. Where can people go to find out about all these different your books, your podcasts, and everything else?
The best place is winwithoutpitching.com, and I'm Blair Enns on most social media platforms.
And you're fairly prolific on LinkedIn as well. So I'd point people to go check that out as well.
Hit and miss. I am today.
5 hours ago you were. So all right, Blair, thanks so much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution Podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution. Revolution. And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution Podcast.